Shall we get started? And then Nicolas, thank you very much for such a long introduction for me. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reiko, and then I'm working for BofA and then ICMA, as Nicolas kindly introduced. And then we have such a great distinguished guest today from Europe. 2 people are joining virtually, and then also 3 in Singapore. And I'm so happy to be here to discuss such important topics for everybody, especially in Asia. Sustainable finance or transition finance is really hot topic for the several years. And then today's panelists are leading each initiative in each entity, leading best practices. So I'm so happy to hear the story from various people with various background and then various experience. So let me start from the first question. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to ask each speaker to make a self-introduction and then also the initiatives to related bond markets in sustainable finance achieving net zero. Okay, so let me start from Mariano of NL. Hello, how are you? Good morning.
Hello, how are you? Yeah, I'm from Repsol.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, NL, yeah, NL. Yeah, Repsol, sorry about that, confusing. Very sorry, thank you. So, Mariano, please start your discussion. So you have been, you can talk about transition financing framework published last year, and then please share your experience through the actual financing using that framework. Could you start, please?
Sure, thank you, Reiko. Okay, in Repsol, the transition financing framework is an output of the decision made by Repsol in 2019 to become a net zero emission by net zero emission company by 2050. Also aligned with the strategic plan 2021-2025 and stepping up the transition and all the new instruments developed under the ICMA working groups at that time. So when we put in place the strategic plan in 2021, we wanted to go further and to deploy the funding strategy according to that transition financing framework in order to reach 2 goals. The first one, to comply with all the best practices in the market and to comply with the all market guidelines, and also to have flexibility in order to have available all the transition instruments in order to fund our strategy. And the outcome was an initiative transition financing framework in 2021, where we have the possibility to issue 2 kinds of instruments. The first one is the use of proceeds with eligible green or transition activities and eligible projects well-defined for all the categories, where there could be transparency and track record that the investment would be allocated to net zero emissions business. And the second instrument is the sustainability link instrument that provides more strategic approach, and it will be raise funds at corporate levels with financial or structural characteristics that could be different depending on the Repsol short, medium, and long-term sustainability performance targets to reduce the carbon intensity with the scope 1, 2, and 3, and in order to be sure that the business model is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Our transition framework agreement also includes the second-party opinion provided with ISS in order to give transparency, robustness, and in order to be sure that our framework complies with the green bond principles, with the sustainability-linked bond principles, also with the recommendations provided in the transition finance handbook by ICMA, and also that will be aligned with the green loan principles and the sustainability loan principles published by Loan Market Association. We published the Transition Framework Agreement in June 2021. It was updated in 2022 because of the Low Carbon Day with the announcement of more ambitious targets to become a net zero emission company. And also we updated the SPO. The experience for us in the Transition Framework Agreement and the two issues of bonds under that framework is extremely positive. It was aligned with the best practices in the market. We know that this market has evolved a lot in the last 3 years, and the second party opinion right now are more rigorous. But for us, it was so positive, the feedback from investor base. We issued 2 bonds under that framework with a huge demand from investors, a very competitive pricing levels that for us is encouraging to be present in this sustainability market. And let me finalize telling you that apart from this transition financing framework, we have also signed sustainability loans with international institutions like the EIB in order to fund advanced biofuels, and also with the Spanish company Reiko in order to fund our industrial transformation.
You have done so many things, and you are really, truly a best practitioner for Asian energy sector clients. So, from investor side, Alban, going back to Singapore, could you talk about Amundi's portfolio management of bonds for net zero alignment in Asia? Is it different from global framework? And then could you share how you measure and track the impact of your portfolio investment, please? You can use this.
First of all, thank you very much, Reiko, to give me the opportunity to be here. At Amundi, first we want to serve our client, but we all want also to play a key role to help the market to improve the standardization and all together to reach this net zero goal. And it's very important, and one of the key benefits of this ICMA principle is to put all together investor, issuer, bank, and regulator, and some government. To answer your question, I will highlight that at Amundi, we have set a 2025 ESG plan with 10 specific goals. And behind these 10 goals, there is 2 dedicated goals for climate change. The first one is to reach 20 billion euro of impact strategy. The second one is to develop net zero ambition strategy on all asset class. These 2 goals will help me to highlight how we want to reach net zero and how we can play this role as an investor. When we are talking about impact, clearly the development of the green bond help us to move to impact assessment with liquid assets. And clearly a way to finance the energy transition and to reach the net zero is to finance green projects. Green bond is a perfect financial tool to do that, but we have to be stringent and we have to be sure that this project have a positive environmental impact. So for our strategy, we invest in green bond, but with green bonds where the issuer is able to assess the impact. And we leverage on the green bond principle. We believe that this international standard help to accelerate the financing of a green project. And it's the way we evaluate the impact of our investment thanks to a very clear KPI when we come to green bonds. The second way to finance the energy transition is to finance issuers that are in line with a Paris trajectory. And clearly here we are at the issuer level. If I take into account the current financial instrument that can help us, SLB is a very nice tool to do that. But we have to keep in mind that the biggest market for issuer is the regular market. And here, we will leverage on the KPI at the company level rather than at the financial level to help all companies that are in a transition. We strongly believe that bondholders have a key role to finance the energy transition, and we are a key partner of company to help them to set their trajectory. And for this second type of strategy, we are leveraging on greenhouse gas emission and also clear strategy. So currently we are working with some assessment like a science-based target initiative to try to understand how companies have put their commitment to reach this net zero. So at this level, it's true that we leverage on commitment. So there is, it's quite important. We try to use also additional KPI like temperature to try to understand what is the trajectory, what is the speed of the decarbonization of different companies. So we have a common framework at Amundi, but in Asia, a few years ago, we worked with AIIB to develop a common framework to help all investors to have a common idea about how we can assess at company level the trajectory. It's true that there is no official taxonomy, so there is some work to do. And I would say we try to be clear about the criteria we are using. But I want just to highlight that the money we manage is not our money, and our clients are quite stringent when we come to green or net zero strategy, and we have to be very cautious about the criteria we are taking into account to provide high level of confidence to be sure that they will be happy to invest in this strategy.
Thank you. But I'm so happy to hear that you are a supporter of Asian transition as far as it's disciplined. Right? Okay, so Kihara-san, could you explain your sustainable finance situation in Japan bond market? You have already touched upon a little in the previous previous keynote speech, but if you can add something, what kind of things do you pay attention to most as governmental official?
Yes, thank you, Reiko-san. Yes, I briefly explained the system of Japanese transitional finance system. But the issue we are now really working on is the issue of the financed emission is a challenge to us. So if the investors or finance institutions are evaluated only by the greenhouse gas emission of their portfolio, or we call it financed emission, they may simply choose to refrain from further investment from high emission industries, regardless of the status of the company's efforts to achieve net zero emission. So in that case, finance emission for these finance institutions who's actively trying to support hard-to-abate sector may increase temporarily, even though their emissions are expected to decrease in the future. So there has to be some kind of mechanism to work around this issue. So in our government, we set up a working group inviting 10 global private financial institutions and others. And we already released some issue-raising paper that you can access. And now we are working on it. And we see the necessity to consider some kind of method of disclosure for financed emission. And some ideas including complementary metrics for financed emission and disclosure framework of this kind of metrics. So that is the now key focus we are now working on to further develop this financed emission.
Thank you, Kihara-san. We have already a question to you, but after the first round, I'm going to ask a question on your GX bonds afterwards. So, Sean, as HSBC, HSBC has already published transition pathways. And then could you share your experience in underwriting which support decarbonization as a global firm based in Asia now? You're based in Asia.
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is I think a lot of work's been done in the last few years, and we've talked about the percentage of the market that's being done in GSS bonds, right? So Asia is now sitting at 22% versus a global average of 14%. So that's a fantastic achievement. And the market share, I think, is fabulous on a global perspective. But I would highlight, though, when you look at the percentage that's coming in green, that's 60% of the global market is coming in green bond format, and only 8% is coming in SLB format. And that's a real challenge, right? Because I think it was also mentioned earlier in the day, only 8% of the global economy is actually in pure green, right? And we need to transition the rest of the economy. So what are the challenges, and why is that such a small percentage of the SLB market? I think when we look at the bonds that we're structuring, if you're doing a green bond, it's actually relatively straightforward these days. There's a broad number of taxonomies at the global level, at the regional level, country level. You can often point to a direct use of proceeds. It meets the taxonomy. It's relatively straightforward to define it, whether it's a good or a badly structured deal. I think when you get to a sustainability-linked bond, then you're starting to talk about transition pathways. And I think we've defined the what is good. What we haven't defined is how fast do we get there. And that needs to be done at the country level, because every country is different. Every country has its own objectives, and it's got to balance, you know, as we talked about, energy security, economic development. It's got to deal with different levels of investment in infrastructure. So all sorts of country-level objectives need to be taken in mind in terms of defining these transition pathways. And we haven't quite got there yet. Right? And it's a very subjective conversation as opposed to green bonds, which is very objective. What's the activity? Is it in the taxonomy? When it comes to transition pathways, a lot of work still needs to be done. But I think it's incredibly important, particularly when it comes to Asia, because so much of the economies in Asia do depend on transition, right? And a lot of state-owned enterprises are responsible for that energy production, and they need that help to transition. So that's where I think a lot of work still needs to be done in what good looks like. And then once that happens, I think we can really start to get comfortable with the SLB market. Once the definitions are good enough, I think we get through a lot of the challenges that we find when we're talking about issues such as greenwashing or the quality of the structuring. A lot of work needs to be done to get there, though.
Thank you. I totally agree with your comments, and we still have many things to do. Yep. Okay, so going to European participant again, Bridget. So CBI has prepared principles of transition. How do you see the market development in the past several years? There are many standards being set up, including Amundi's one or HSBC one, but how do you incorporate those initiatives into your standard, or your into CBI standard? Over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So yes, in 2020, we put together, Client Bonds put together 5 principles around transition finance to kind of begin our thinking around what transition means and what we need to do to transition and what that looks like in different sectors. One of the things that we kind of said in that first kind of paper was that we all need to transition. So in a sense, the line between what is labeled as transition and what is labeled as green is not nearly as important as that it happens, and that it happens fast. So lots of different sectors have been very easily incorporated under green, even though they're not anywhere near zero today, right? So the line between green and transition is very blurred. But what we said is really that it needs to happen. So then we think about, if it needs to happen, what do you need to do that? So the first thing was thinking about a lot of the different sectors, which my panelists have mentioned, some of the heavy industrial, hard to abate sectors, and how we go forward with those, and what kind of criteria and thresholds we need to have a look at what is good in that sector for now, and what good looks like in 10 years, and what good looks like in 20 years. So that will change over time. So that we have been doing a lot of work on hard to abate sectors over the last few years, and that continues. That will affect kind of use of proceeds, green bonds, transition bonds, however they're labeled, as well as other SLBs. But then we started to do more work on the entity level, which other of my colleagues have mentioned, because there was quite a big gap between if we think about a particular project that may be labeled as green, that's fine, but the more important thing is that all projects within an entity are transitioning and transitioning fast. And so the first work we did was thinking about what are the components of an entity transition, and then how do you then move towards certifying that? So that's what we've done most recently, is thinking about what does a credible transition plan look like. And as my colleagues have mentioned, this has been challenging, right? And the market is really developing its awareness around how do you assess this, and how do you take that forward-looking point, which was mentioned as well, as we're not really looking around carbon footprinting of portfolios. What we need to think about is how we assess the forward-looking nature of entities. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on that, and then trying to incorporate some of this thinking on the sector level into taxonomies we work on around the world, and working with other frameworks. So that's been really key, is trying to incorporate as many as the different frameworks that are available into our thinking and bring them together. And what we found is that mostly we're speaking the same language, right? We're moving in the same direction. A lot of the core components are very similar. There will certainly be tweaks. There's certainly different ways we think about them, particularly regionally, but mostly we're kind of working together. So a key role for us going forward is really tying in with our peers, utilizing SBTI pathways, other pathways, utilizing the science that is available to us, and the frameworks that are available, and kind of bringing those together in a global context.
Thank you. You have been doing a lot of things to combine all the existing pathways, I know. Thank you very much. And then so far, I have two questions about the first question. So first, Alban. Okay, so your comments about issuer level KPI and strategy suggest you don't see the need for label transition, the instruments, whether transition use of proceeds or SLBs. So the question is that you don't need label transaction. Is that true?
I'm not sure to really understand the question. So at Amundi, we leverage on label transaction. We try to push for standardization. It's true that at Amundi we have a dedicated team to look at green bonds, and we have some green bonds analysts based in Singapore also. But all investors do not have the same capabilities. So standardization is very important. So we push for the current principles, so the green bonds, the social bonds. It's true that we are a little bit worried about a new name like transition bonds, how it could be interpreted. Do investors will be confused? So at this stage, we really be focused on this first label bonds, and we pay attention to other labels. And I have to also highlight that in our funds, in our local legal documentation, we refer to the green bond principle, and its name green bonds. So sometimes our legal department also challenge them if we put other name in this dedicated green bond strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Kihara, I have a question to you from the audience. So would Japan consider issuing sovereign sustainability linked bonds instead of use of proceed transition bonds? So what do you think? If you can give our hints at this moment, maybe it's too early to make a decision, but what is your thought?
Yes, so I believe this question is about the Japan's government's GX transition bond. We are still now, we will now work on the framework. We just passed the law last month, so we're taking momentary rest. But we will design the structure of the bond, and our aim is to issue within this fiscal year, Japanese fiscal years, by next March. But we're thinking on the scope and the area. The hint is in the GX basic policy that we announced already in February. It does has a long list of which sector, which technology has a potential. So we're gathering all these information and now trying to design the GX bond. Thank you.
Thank you. So investors' insight or market stakeholders' insight would be very appreciated, I guess. Okay, so let's move on. The second question to you, to all of you, just transition. Decarbonizing is very important, but transition has impact on customers, employees, suppliers, and then communities sometimes. What risks and opportunities have you each identified for the groups in your value chain? Okay, so let me start from Alban as Amundi, because you have implemented the concept of just transition for climate strategy. So you may share your views on this.
Yes, so just to remind that the word just transition is part of the Paris Agreement. So it's fully embedded in this agreement. So when we want to build a new strategy 4 years ago dedicated to the Paris Agreement, we want to integrate this idea about just transition. So we were able to build with our ESG research team a dedicated rating to understand how companies take into account social issues linked to the energy transition. This rating is based on the 4 main stakeholders impacted: workers, clients, territories, and society. As you already mentioned, we know that some social issue will be very important. If you close a coal power plant, how the company will be sure that all employees will be able to find a job in the company or in the same area. And we have already some very good example of issues that have a very clear framework on that. And I saw this morning that Iberdrola is in the room, and clearly you can ask Iberdrola their criteria to manage how they close a coal power plant. The automobile sector is another example. We estimate that in average, the automobile sector have to decline by 30% their total employees by 2030 due to the move to electric sector. How this company deal with that, how they will train their employees to be sure that their employees will be able to work on electric vehicle. And on territories, there is also some important impact if you close a big industry, and so they need to talk with territories. At society level, we believe that, I would say, sustainable tax is a very important topic, and clearly we know that some sector will suffer a lot from the energy transition, and other will have a strong benefit, and tax is a very nice way to redistribute the value to help sector in difficulties thanks to other sector. So it's also in line with Amundi sustainable ambitions, because we want first fight climate change and also fight social inequality. And when we are talking about net zero, we really want to be sure that the social criteria are taken into account to avoid to forget people on the road.
Thank you. So you're talking about energy sector transition, so it's a great question to Mariano, Repsol as well. Could you share your views on just transition as an energy sector issue, please? Over to you.
Sure, thank you, Reiko. There are many definitions of just a transition, but as a summary, we could say that it is a one that leaves no one behind. And at Repsol, we advocate for just energy transition towards a low emissions future. Let me tell you here that it's quite relevant to talk about energy trilemma in order to ensure that people has access to sustainable, efficient, and secure energy at a cost affordable for all of one. So we shouldn't wait only sustainable and not taking into account the other two principles, efficiency and securement, in order to avoid that the cost of this transition would be worst for vulnerable society, vulnerable people. And Repsol, we think that in order to address the just energy transition, we should take into account all the available technologies in order to fulfill the needs of the society. And as of today, many renewables technologies are invented and developed, but not all of them are fully implemented because of they are more expensive compared to conventional fossil fuels. So we should encourage investments in energy technologies that will require more finance effort in order to take into account also the regulation and to be sure that they will not change if we are in the middle of the game. So regulation is key in order to be able that the different technologies would compete between each other in order to find the right solution for the problems at the low cost, okay? And in order to minimize also the social and economic impact. And employment should be encouraged in this just energy transition. We should adapt the existing employment in order to be sure that we not lose quality industrial and to avoid movements of workers to different geographies. So in this just energy transition, we should take into account a lot of factors, social, economical, political, technological, in order to speed the achievement of energy transition. In Repsol, we published in 2022 the sustainability policy, and it's based on just energy transition. And we should comply, and we should base on the principles of efficiency, sustainable, and justice. We should also take into account the human rights and always be focused also in the most vulnerable part of the society. And let me finish giving you the 4 pillars of the just energy transition framework in Repsol that is based in universal net zero energy, workforce evolution, community resilience, and finally collaboration and transparency.
Thank you. It's a big challenge, but good luck. Thank you. So,
thank you.
Sean, how do you cope with just transition concept as a financial industry?
Sure. Look, just looking at the opportunities and the risks, as you mentioned them earlier, I think the opportunities are obviously enormous, right? We're talking about 125 trillion worth of investment required by 2050. And then within that, you're probably looking at 25 to 30 trillion by 2030. And we're well behind that, right? That's talking about 3 to 4 trillion per year. And probably the energy investment's probably only about 1.8 trillion a year, and half of that's still in fossil fuels, right? So we're only talking about less than $1 trillion going into energy transition, which is just not enough, right? And so if you also look at the Asian bond markets, we're only talking about 200 million a year or so worth of GSS's bonds. So clearly there's a huge opportunity to scale up to finance the transition. But I think when I look at the risks, the net zero 2050 is an incredibly important way to push the market, I think, towards some form of transition. And it's going to be hugely influential. It's only at the start of that journey. The Net Zero Banking Alliance is about 40% of global banking assets. The fund management commitments is about 58 trillion worth of assets, if I've got it right, which is about 60% probably of the global market for assets under management. So it's a huge percentage. And that's going to drive a real conversation about if we're all committed to net zero 2050, what does 2040 look like? What does 2030 look like? And then if we've got those interim targets, how am I going to meet my 2030 target? And the definition of financed and facilitated emissions and PCAF, all of that's kind of a work in progress as we get there, but it's going to hit the rubber's going to hit the road in the next couple of years. My biggest concern is that when that happens and people define their transition pathways, they're then going to want to understand what sits in their portfolio and whether those clients are aligned to those or not. So a huge amount of work needs to be done by corporates and countries across the region, in Asia in particular, around that transition pathway. And if they're not on it and they haven't got a definition of it, my biggest worry is their access to capital gets cut. But it also needs to be fair. Right? If you look at Indonesia, for example, the energy production, I think it's 600 million tons of carbon per annum from the energy sector, which looks, very, very high. But then if you consider that actually their energy consumption per capita in terms of carbon is half that of the rest of the world at the moment, right? So the definition of fair also depends on your perspective. Are you looking at total emissions? Are you looking at per capita? What constitutes fair transition? Who bears the cost of that? And if we don't get that right, then suddenly the easiest thing to do for the banks and the asset management sector would just be to say, okay, well, we're not just going to finance that industry, we're just going to move to something else. And then actually you have enormous fallout in terms of economic damage and social damage across the region. So I think that's why the next couple of years are going to be incredibly important in terms of defining those pathways, because I think the net zero 2050 commitments are going to drive change, enormous change in the next few years as people start to gear up towards hitting those 2030 interim targets.
Thank you. That's true. So Bridget, as for transition and then also just transition, could you share your views how the standard of CBI or other international standard can contribute to encourage just transition to stakeholders in sustainable market, sustainable finance, sorry.
Sure. So yeah, I think as a first step, we like to think of just transition as both broad and narrow. So from a broad perspective, a failure to transition is also very unjust. So we have to really remember that the work we are doing to initiate a transition and to make sure it happens from a global perspective is really important. So that's kind of our starting point, to recognize that if we fail, that will have very unjust consequences on communities around the world, and particularly in emerging markets. So we really need to make sure that the transition happens as a kind of starting point, and that it's not, the just transition is not used as a get out of jail free card, which it sometimes is, right? To go more slowly, to not act, etc. So we need to kind of first think about from a broad perspective. But from a more narrow perspective, clearly there will be implications for certain communities, and particularly those sectors which we call it a transition away. So there's certain sectors which will need to decarbonize, steel, cement, etc. There will be impacts there, but they're not as huge because we still need steel and cement in 2050, right? But for transition away sectors where we're phasing out coal, etc., those impacts are much bigger. And that's when we really need to think about the communities, particularly coal communities, and how we bring these communities into the standards we create. So we've just done some work on coal phase out and coal transition with the Rocky Mountains Institute, and just part of it is a core principle. So it covers a lot of other things, like making sure we're not phasing out on one hand of coal and then phasing in of coal on the other hand. So that's a kind of key part of the guidelines. But then the just component is really critical. So that's what we're kind of working to do, to bring these things into guidance, which then go on to hopefully some of the mechanisms that are being discussed, energy transition mechanisms, JETP, etc. So these are the kind of big coal phase-out mechanisms that are being discussed at a global level, which we're kind of looking at in different ways. And then the last thing is to try and think about the transition being more just, right? So the just transition framing assumes that the current world we exist in is very just, which we know it is not. But a transition to a new energy future can be more just, right? So we have to really think about how we create jobs around the world, and especially in emerging markets. So this is a kind of big consideration where you're losing coal jobs in certain markets, and they are not necessarily the same markets where, say, new solar panel manufacturing jobs are going to be. So we need to figure this out, and how we kind of make that global distribution of jobs more equitable, and bring this into how we promote incentives and standards as well.
Thank you. So Kihara-san, the same question to you as a public body. Could you share Japanese initiatives to implement Japan just transition concept?
Yes, just transition is very important. The G7's communique also, we highlight the importance of the investment in human capital to ensure just transition. And also in our GX Promotion Act, just passed the Diet last month, also places just transition as one of the basic concepts for realizing green transformation. And the just transition is a very broad word. It has several aspects. So looking from the labor policy aspect, the government places investment in human capital as a priority. So we decided to increase the support measure to up to 1 trillion yen over the next 5 years. And the measures include organizing training courses for green business, supporting in-house capacity building for reskilling, etc., etc. But then there is aspect of SME policy. So our government, particularly METI, provide multiple support for SMEs that will restructure its business and shift to low carbon technology and businesses. We provide subsidies for necessary investment for green product and services. And then lastly, and more importantly, this is an industrial policy. It has an industrial policy aspect. So for the hard-to-abate sectors that aim to reach carbon neutral by developing innovative technologies, engaging with them rather than divesting can be recognized as just transition. The government supports challenging R&D and also demonstration projects and reduce risk throughout the journey of green transformation. So developing system to promote transition finance is also crucial to keep their journey going. So, so this is an important task of finding opportunity for the hard-to-abate sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Asia, not only Japan, but emerging countries need to pay attention to just transition because we will have a big industrial change going forward. Okay, so we have 3 minutes to go. And then are there any questions from the audience on the floor? Please, thank you.
Thank you for explaining. I am Kazushi Shimizu and I work in the Securities, the promoter at the sustainability installation business in Tokyo. I'm glad to have this opportunity to have our question. I think the Japanese is leading the way in transition finance globally. I would like to ask Kihara-san, in your presentation, you stressed the Japanese official politics so far have been decided and launched. As an underwriter in Japan, we would like to expand the market for green and transition finance based on the basic guidelines and the update ICMA handbook. There are any politics being considered to further expand the market, especially for transition finance. For example, Kihara-san already mentioned GX bonds. Yesterday, Prime Minister Kishida mentioned he would like to issue GX bond transformation, green transformation bonds as JGB transition bond. In particular, the government 150 trillion yen investment will be needed in the next decade. The politics next government that contribute the expansion of transition finance, including GX bonds or other politics. Would you this contribute to the expansion transition finance? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. So how to further expand the transition finance beyond what is now? And I think the answer is to how to connect with the real demand in the market. So I already explained about the 4 pillar policy tools that we are working on. But then the government will issue the government transition bond to 20 trillion yen in the next 10 years. So that's kind of 2 trillion yen per year. So that's already twice the cumulative 1 trillion that's in the market. So that's going to expand the market. But then we are also working on expanding in the Asian market. So we have this Asian Transition Finance Study Group. They already developed the Asia version transition finance guidance. And they also issued some guiding information on what is transition technology, the Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia. They released some booklet about what is transition technology in Asia. So we are very happy to work on all these tools and measures to expand the market, but we are confident that there's a strong need up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but through the discussion yesterday and then today, we really feel that transition is really important in the globe, on the globe, especially in Asia, and then collaboration work among all the region sector is the key to succeed the challenge for all human beings. So let's work together going forward in a productive manner and then present manner. That's my message. And thank you very much for all panelists. And then thank you very much for joining from Europe. Thank you.